This is panel 6 of day 2. It's called 2021 Democracy Under Siege, Impact of the Pandemic on Human Rights and Democracy. This is co-convened by the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies, more popularly known as CANVAS. I will now hand over the time to the moderator and speaker, Srdja Popovic. Srdja, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for being awake and present in such an early time in the morning. My name is Srdja Popovic. I'm Executive Director of Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategy. And thanks to Mr. Gomez and Ms. Chi Dong, we are all virtually traveling with you today on this very important conference. Pandemic is something that influences our lives. Pandemic is something that influences us all, and pandemic is something that particularly influences activism. And here are some really cool people and cool practitioners and researchers that are looking into how pandemic influences activism and how it influences democracy. So without further ado, I will start by introducing today's panel. And this is what we know, this is where we are. We'll be talking mostly about the COVID-19 in the world. We're going to talk mostly about where we are in a stage of protests across the globe. We'll be focusing particularly on Asia, and we'll be having one global globetrotter, Ben Press, who will be talking a lot about the global trends in protests. We'll have one local practitioner who did amazing work in implementing some of the wisdoms in democracy, in fighting for democracy throughout the COVID in one of the societies in Asia, which is backpedaling on democracy right now. It's Mohammad Alshatri bin Abdullah, whom I know as Matt, and you can call him Matt. So Ben, Matt, and Srdja, it's easy. We would strongly encourage whatever questions from the audience. We will be following chat. We would like this thing to be as interactive as possible. So without further ado, I would like to talk a little bit about who we are and what we do. My organization is 16 years old now. It started after the scene that you see on the slide, which was a successful Serbian revolution back there in 2000. Serbs have done many bad things in the past. Seems that their nonviolent struggle was one of the good things because there was a growing interest in the methodology of the struggle. Some of the veterans of the Serbian resistance movement formed organization named CANVAS, and since 2004 we are struggling to build a toolkit for activists across the globe. That brought us to Asia, basically working with 12 Asian countries through our offshoot called FDA, and a coordinator of FDA, Chi, is today with us. Matt was also one of the people who coordinated our effort to throw out the big conference in Kuala Lumpur right before COVID. We also have Mr. Gomez, with whom we are cooperating closely. Once again, thanks for this cooperation. Thanks for the hard work you do on the research, which you can find in the conference papers, which looks on the impact of COVID-19 and moves of autocratic governments towards shrinking democratic space, specifically in Southeast Asia. Pleasure working with you, pleasure cooperating with you, pleasure learning from you all. So, welcome to Nowadays and what we are going to be discussing today. Obviously, the question number one, how global pandemic created very fertile grounds for autocratic tendencies. From surfacing things like limiting physical space for protest, all the way to more substantial things like using restrictive internet laws to even expose truth about how government response to COVID is sloppy all across Asia. We see all kinds of autocratic tendencies. And, you know, coming from Europe and living in the US, I will tell you, this is not the fruit that grows only in Asia, like this stinky fruit. It is also a fruit that grows across the globe. A lot of the leaders across the globe seen their chance to shrink freedoms. Also, we are witnessing the 13th year in a row, if you follow Freedom House or Prosperity Index of Legatum Institute, when it comes to democracy shrinking. We're getting back to 90s. when it comes to democratic countries. But we are also witnessing a very positive trends about which my co-panelists and guests here, Ben and Matt, are going to talk more. It is a rise of a people power, rise of ownership of a people power, and the way the movements creatively accommodate to this new situation. We're obviously witnessing the big struggles all across the democratic world. What happens in America has an impact in all world. What happens in Europe has an impact in a region and whole world. And specifically, many interesting developments in Asia that I will tackle in a minute or two. Most visible, the catastrophic situation in Burma after the putschists just removed the democratically elected government on February the 1st. Question number one, is democracy dying? We are now living in a world where 54% of global population lives in partly free or non-free countries. This is very different picture than 10 years ago. In 92 countries, democracy was showing a kind of the backlash or the backslide. And even worse, it is not happening only in a traditional autocracies. That doesn't mean the Kim Jong-uns of this world are becoming particularly more effective. It comes with events like coup in Thailand, comes with events like coup in Burma, but not only shocking, democracy is dying slowly. If you take a look at the previously democratic country, which backpedaled in democracy in 2020 during COVID, you will find surprising flags. You will find the flag of the United States. You'll find the flag of India. You'll find the flag of Brazil. You will find the flag of Turkey for the last 10 years. In all of these countries, you had democratically elected governments that were attacking some elements of democracy or civil society or human rights or gender rights or LGBT rights. And this is the trend that we are witnessing. So on one front, we need to face dramatic events and find a way to cope with countries like Burma. On the other hand, we need to find a way to defend democratic institutions in the countries we live. Whenever there's darkness, there is always a glimpse of hope. Thing number one, the movements are very different animals than they were 10 years ago, which is why we are bringing Ben Press to you. He's going to dissect this new phenomenal way that movements spread. Another one, we may be witnessing the opportunity after the crisis. If you take a look at the change in the United States, if you take a look at the trend in places like Brazil or Philippines, you will see that accountability for handling COVID may be the Achilles heel of autocratic or autocratically leaning leaders. One reason for this is there is no PR that can cover the people's deaths in 21st century. This is not Stalin's Russia, where you can eradicate millions of people in famine, and because you control press, nobody sees this dead people. Also, we witness the global rise, the generational rise, the demographic rise of environmental movement. Very interesting phenomenon, which hits even the high schools across the globe. What experience and science tells us, when you see the generation rising, it's going to be the long-term uprising, because these people will be 19 after they're 18, and then they will be 21. In the meantime, a lot of them will become eligible to vote, and a lot of this sentiment for people power, keeping governments accountable, or taking a look at which kind of planet we are leaving to our daughters and sons, will become as a bill on a forthcoming elections to conservative and autocratic politicians across the globe. We are witnessing hotspots in the battle of democracy in Europe. It may be Belarus. In Asia, it may be Burma. But also, we are witnessing the very vivid wave of movements across the what was used to be known as democratic world, starting with the United States, following up with Europe. We are taking a look at what's happening in India, for example, Brazil, Philippines. Once again, previously partly or complete democracies are witnessing, on one hand, that try to topple this democracy from the top, on another, a very strong response and accountability outcry from the huge masses of population. Ben will talk about the numbers a little bit later. What we have learned from a pandemic world is that, yes, pandemic and emergency measures may be a very fertile ground for shrinking people's freedom, but movements accommodate to this, where they are accommodating through the tactical issues, using internet more or physical distancing, or more strategic issues, which is like Matt will explain in Malaysia, shifting the line of their work from human rights and democracy when they were the target of the government to really finding a shelter for homeless people and community services. Whatever it is, this is the way the movements are building their visibility, they're building their numbers, and they're building their reputation. Also, in many countries, the issues which were long pushed under the carpet, issues like systemic racism in the United States or 26-year-old dictatorship in Belarus, just flipped to the top because of COVID. This is a physical phenomenon. If you heat the pot and you keep the lid on, the things will eventually explode. And as Ben tells you, whoever takes a closer look into the global people power movements may predict a wave of these movements coming in forthcoming years. Of course, we are in Asia. Well, you guys are in Asia. We are in screens in Asia. And it won't go without mentioning the very dramatic events in Asia. Once again, starting from the bleak side, what's happening in Hong Kong after a very hopeful movement with the newest restrictions from mainland China, what's happening in Myanmar with a bloody and oppressive coup, but also very creative and strategic ways the activists are focusing on main pillars of this coup, where this is international and domestic legitimacy of the Putsch government in Myanmar, where this is their wallet, because the modern dictatorships are autocracies, INC, and there are multifaceted interests and business interests of these people, which can be tackled through nonviolent struggle, where we're looking about the Malaysia, where we got the same UNMO government that nobody elected on the last election. In fact, the last elections in Malaysia were the referendum against the ruling party's corruption, but they somehow sneaked back through the cooking stuff Matt will tell us more about. At the same time, we are witnessing a very strong challenge to status quo. You want to take a look at the Philippines, you want to take a look at the Thailand. Obviously, there is a turn of a tide. Was 2 years ago considered to be a very solid grip on power of autocratic leaders, is now challenged in many different ways. Most importantly, and what our Asian project is all about, we are seeing the growing solidarity among pro-democracy and human rights defenders across Asia. And Milk Tea Alliance is probably the one thing that you can put the finger on. And if you don't know about it, please Google it and learn about this. It's the first time in history, or at least the first time I'm aware of, that you have the pro-democracy and human rights movements cooperating closely. You have thousands of people turning in the streets of Malaysia and Thailand in solidarity with happening in Myanmar, when we see the things happening in places like Singapore, and in solidarity with the people in Hong Kong, and so long and so forth. This is a very encouraging trend. The horizontality of the new movements may come with a learning from each other. This horizontal learning may be the key on how we see movements, but also how the movements progress in the future, coming from the organization focused on education. This is a big passion and a big chance. But Serbs are talking too much, and without further ado, I will invite you all to post questions, raise hands, and I will give the floor to our first today's speaker. His name is Benjamin Press. He comes from a very prominent organization called Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. But more than the organization, I'm thrilled with the Global Protest Tracker, the project that Ben handles, which looks into the people power movements. So Ben will put a little bit more light on data, but also the nature of this new horizontal movements. Ben, sorry that the introduction was not that formal, but I know and admire you a lot. The floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Srdja. It's always a lot of fun to be with you. And thanks so much to the Asia Center for including me. Srdja, you may need to finish sharing your screen so I can share mine. Let's see here. Here we go. Is that coming through okay? Great.
Yes.
Well,
very good.
It's great to be with you all this morning, evening, depending on where you are. And thank you, Srdja, again, for that very kind introduction. Listen, Srdja has outlined very compellingly the fact that democracy worldwide is in very dire straits and that authoritarianism is on the rise. This trend is evident across any source of data you look at, whether it's Freedom House, VDEM, wherever you look. We're seeing a really troubling trend of both democratic backsliding and authoritarian confidence. But citizens are not just rolling over and blindly accepting what their governments are doing. Instead, activists worldwide have ignited the largest protest wave in human history, challenging authoritarian regimes and democratic systems alike. As the data on rising global protests makes clear, protest means something different in 2020, 2021 than it did, say, in 1980. Something clearly is undergirding the rise of a new, more central role for protests in political life and for protests, full stop. I would argue that this has to do with the changing nature of power. In an age where power has become diffuse, so too has the form of protests, where mass movements used to be driven by the hubs of civic life, like unions, political parties, civic groups, and religious organizations. They're now increasingly being driven by nameless groups of activists. Leaderlessness, however, is not just a protest typology. It is a set of explicit strategies that organizers and activists are adopting to better achieve their objectives, and a core reason for why we're seeing this huge protest wave, which hasn't ebbed, as you can see from this chart, even amid the coronavirus pandemic. If you look at this data, you can see that 2020 over 2019, a year before the coronavirus pandemic, we saw a huge rise in protests last year. So it's just been an amazing thing to see. I would argue that there are really four key dimensions to leaderless protest movements. First, they have a spontaneous and discrete trigger. Leaderless protest movements emerge spontaneously out of anything, really. From a natural disaster or an extrajudicial killing to a stolen election or a subsidy reduction. Though these triggers are very, very hard to predict, activists capitalize on the relationship between the event, the trigger, and broader frustrations that exist within the political community. Whether it was Mohammad Bouazizi lighting himself on fire in Tunisia in 2011 in response to police humiliating him, or Breonna Taylor and George Floyd being murdered in 2020 in the United States, these events spark a wave of anger that encompasses a set of issues that go far beyond the initial trigger. Second, and this is implied in the name of leaderless, they lack core visible leaders. But that doesn't mean that there isn't leadership involved. Rather, leadership is more collective and horizontal. As many leaders, for example, in the Black Lives Matter protests have said, it is leaderful rather than leader-led. Leadership in these contexts is depersonalized. Organizers are using alternative structures, from anonymous online forums to open-air assemblies, to determine movement objectives and strategies. But because these protests generally lack an actionable, consensus-driven agenda, dissent and disagreement can lead to vague goals and divergent strategies. Third, these protests are highly decentralized because they don't rely on core leaders. This model creates space for anybody and everybody to take ownership. Anybody can see a protest breaking out in another city, take inspiration from it, and post on social media saying, hey, come out to the town square tomorrow at noon. Decentralization allows for a new level of inclusivity. They are, for example, much more local, reaching into communities that might not ever have participated, including a deep well of new participants outside of politically engaged big cities. The Yellow Vest movement in France is a particularly good example of this. You didn't just see them protesting in the streets of Paris, you saw them protesting at every roundabout in every village across France. Finally, these leaderless protests spread rapidly through the information space. This is the reason that they're able to expand so rapidly. They spread like wildfire through structured and unstructured information networks. Organizers rely on larger forums like social media, the internet, and messaging channels like WhatsApp, and informal conversations between people. Social media is especially important since these platforms have made reaction times virtually immediate, and they can help sustain conversation, allowing for a more open exchange of ideas and updates across geographic divides. The rise of this model is no accident. Two complementary dynamics are fueling its spread, I would argue. First, as we've discussed, these protests are highly inclusive. But secondly, leaderless protests are hard to repress, and activists around the world are emulating this model, especially in autocracies. In a recent study that my colleague Tom Carruthers and I performed, we found that only about 6% of protests in authoritarian regimes were rooted in traditional civil society structures. This means that agency is so diffuse that detaining a few people or even a few thousand or shutting down the internet can't curb the movement. The only other real repression option is this term that Srdja loves, kinetic force, but that's really costly for autocrats. So they're left with two bad options from their perspective: either repress and risk further inciting protests or spurring defections from the security sector, or alternatively, the autocrat can reform and risk destabilizing the entire power structure. This conundrum really is the key decision point for many autocracies and the make or break point of whether or not an anti-authoritarian movement is going to succeed. So to close, more people are taking to the streets than ever before, and they're demanding more of their governments than ever before. This picture here is drawn from Carnegie's Global Protest Tracker and shows all of the countries that have faced significant anti-government protest movements just since 2017. We've tracked nearly 300, a rate of one breaking out somewhere in the world, roughly every 4 days. As protesters find new strategies and models, and governments find new ways to push back, the form of protest is likely to change, whether towards leaderless models or otherwise, but the underlying dynamic is not. Protests are becoming a part of political life like they never have before. So when we think of the future of protest movements, sure, it's a question of form, but it's also a question of function. As protests become more integrated into the political landscape, they are likely to become a durable, if not permanent, fixture of our politics. And as a result, it's hard to see when this protest wave will break. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Impressive as usual and straight to the point. First of all, I would like to invite people from the room to raise hands, people online to ask questions on chat and Facebook. And while this is happening, I would like to ask you my favorite question. If these protests are different than before, when you had, it's like typically you have a labor union organizing the protests for labor rights in 50s or 60s. So there is a central organization behind the protest. There is a lot of different groups protesting, but you can pinpoint a finger and say, okay, this is the main organizers, while we see the new protests are happening and then the organizations are catching up with them. So it's a very different dynamics and definitely harder to repress. What happens with goals? So how do you determine the goals where it's more complicated, it's more diffuse? How these new groups are figuring out what may be the smallest common denominator for them?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. And it's one that movements across the world have grappled with since the rise of leaderless protest movements. I think one of the greatest examples of this, Srdja, is the Occupy Wall Street movement that broke out in the United States in the wake of the financial crisis. This was a movement that embodied deliberately this leaderless typology. It was one of the first to do so, but it had deliberately no agenda and no program. And as a result, it succeeded in harnessing a massive amount of popular anger, but failed in achieving any sort of systemic change because there was no deliberative structure. This is a challenge that I think activists around the world have sought to address and have succeeded in many cases in doing. For example, the umbrella movement in Hong Kong is a wonderful example of a broad-based, deliberately leaderless movement that was driven by a consensus agenda that was put together by groups of activists using online fora and kind of revolving around a core group of nameless and faceless organizers. We also see this in places like Sudan, where the activist environment is very different. The Sudanese Professionals Association was a semi-clandestine network of activists that formulated an agenda for the protest movement while remaining faceless and relatively anonymous. So it figured out how to balance the importance of anonymity and facelessness in an autocratic repressive environment with putting together a consensus political program that they were then able to present to the regime and ultimately leading to its collapse. So it's something that I'm very optimistic that activists will find solutions for, but it's certainly something that's an ongoing struggle.
Yeah, one of the things we very often outline in our discussions, we're in conferences where we're working with activists, that unity is the key. And moving from the two great examples you listed into Asia, you may take a look at the Myanmar. It was the population responding to the coup first, and basically creating a movement which is called CDM and civil disobedience movement, and it was done through the local groups and local activists, very similar to the neighborhood committees in Sudan. And only then the political elite, which was hit hard by a coup, everybody was put in jail, even the local organizations of the winning party, NLD, were kind of robbed of freedom or of space. Then they figure out how to create a shadow government. And now we see these two things working in some kind of cohesion. So I think this is a very important question, especially when you formulate the goals, because no movement in history have ever won anything without having clear goals. For those of you who love to read, there's an amazing book by a guy called Mitza White, The End of Protest, and he was a Wall Street insider. In fact, one of the persons first to post the thing that sparked the Occupy Wall Street, and he was the one arguing exactly as Ben, that without movement goals, it can't be really managed. One question from the audience: what is the role fear and self-censorship in preventing spontaneous protests, for example, in Vietnam, Cambodia, Burma, and Singapore? Very interesting. Ben, do we see people more afraid or less afraid across the globe? How this protest numbers work with the level of oppression?
It's a good question. And I think this is something that kind of strikes at the heart of the paradox that we see, that these regimes and these political societies look very stable until they're not, right? Belarus looked very stable until millions of people came into the street. The challenge here is that in autocratic environments where people think that the cost of independent political action is very high, they're not willing to pay that cost necessarily themselves. But when it becomes a collective action situation where they see other courageous activists around them coming into the streets, the marginal cost for the individual of taking that action goes down. So it may be very difficult and as a result, very rare for there to be a one-man protest in a place like Singapore. But it's not at all impossible to imagine that hundreds of thousands of people in a similarly repressive place like Myanmar would pour into the streets, because you have this critical mass of courageous actors who are establishing kind of the leading edge of the movement, which enables other people to come out and add their voices to it. So fear is a powerful force for the individual, but in the collective, people are able to overcome it when they feel that that cost is worth it for themselves and is being lowered by the collective action.
Yeah, also one thing that comes through anecdotal work with I don't know how many countries, and a lot of them very oppressive. We had this marvelous opportunity through Canvas workshops to work with the people from the people with some of the worst dictatorships across the globe. Is the fact that there is a moment in time where this is a strategic approach to things and a good tactic, like in Chile, you had a Pinochet state, and then one day people decided they will walk half speed, drive half speed. It was very difficult to oppress. It was kind of a dilemma action. And there's a great documentary where one of the participants said, seeing so many people participating in this somehow just broke this big bubble of fear, because we just simply doing these small little things understood that we are the many and they are the few. And once the fear gets to the place where it starts eroding, you need a real slaughterhouse to impose it again. So once again, back to the kinetic force, it's one thing to keep people scared as mouses not to leave home. It's yet another thing to send tanks and kill thousands of people. This is still 21st century world. You can do it, but it will come with a price. For Burmese military, it comes with a dire price. The economy is collapsing. Nobody wants to do business with them. For China, they are now the burden and the pariah. So it's like you can take a look at this and say, yes, the regime will do ABC, but then it will come with a cost. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, take a lead, please.
Hi, thank you. I'm Robin Ramcharan from Asia Center. Ben,
hi,
thank
Robin.
you. Hi, how are you? Ben, very interesting. Of course, you also, if I'm pronouncing your name right, Srdja. Yes.
You're pronouncing better than any American I've met last time.
Very good, very good.
Ben is excluded. He practiced.
Okay, all right. Ben, as I was listening to you, I very quickly, I was just intrigued by the cost-benefit analysis that you were offering. But perhaps there are other ways of looking at it that, emotion comes into this as well. And so emotion, conviction, and so on. And so there are, you could say, maybe these lone voices or small groups, who have carried the struggle forward and who have galvanized others along the way, maybe not mass protests, but in different ways. And so, I have one sitting next to me at the moment, right? So just a thought, but if I could ask you this specific question on leaderless protests, here in Thailand, this is a casual observation. There's a lot of that going on, but ultimately the authorities will need to speak with someone, and they will need to bargain, and they will need to have a negotiating position, and there will have to be some kind of structure. So I wonder what your thought on that is.
It's a great question, and one that keeps recurring. I agree completely that some level of interaction between the authorities and the protesters is necessary. I think the solution there is some sort of democratic process among the protesters themselves to find people who really represent the sentiment. This can be done kind of preemptively by having a network of core organizers who opt to remain nameless. I think this is probably the most common method of successful movements that adopt that. Again, I keep coming back to the Sudan case because I think it's just so wonderful. But activists coalesced under this what was a labor union, a network of labor unions, and co-opted that organizational structure as a political structure and leveraged that as a negotiating platform with the authorities. In Belarus, rallying around political figures who embody the aspirations of the movement but may not have directly instigated it can also be another way of doing that. In Hong Kong as well, you had a core group of activists who, again, may not have necessarily said, come out and protest at this time, but were representative of the hopes and dreams of the people who were protesting. And those were people with whom the authorities could have negotiated. In the Hong Kong case, unfortunately, obviously, they opted not to do that. So it's a really hard question. The thing is that it's going to vary context to context, and prescribing one particular structure won't necessarily work because each landscape of repression, but also activism, will produce a different structure. So it's hard to say a particular thing, but I'd say in general, finding a democratic process among the protesters and the activists to select a group, not necessarily a person, usually it's a group, to come forward and represent their aspirations through, I think is probably the most effective way to do that.
Great. Any other questions from the whole side of the things, or I can leave the stage to Matt. Matt, take a lead. You were patiently waiting in the shadows.
Thank you, Srdja. Let me share my screen. All right. First of all, I would like to thank Asia Center and also Srdja Ben for making this happen, and also Canvas. I think this is an opportunity for us all to learn from one another in terms of organizing and social movement and people's movement around the world, which is what I've always been passionate about. So my topic of today is a rise of authoritarian regime in the name of crisis management, a Malaysian case. All right. Okay, first of all, since start of last year, I think March, the government has declared a movement control order called the MCO, and also they also declared a state of emergency and also move ahead to suspend the parliament in terms of managing because of the COVID crisis. So to give a little bit context of this, I think last year, in 2018, the opposition actually won the first time since 60 years. We have won the elections by forming an electoral pact with some of the people from the previous government as well. But last year, in 2020, we see there's a little bit of coup that happened in Malaysia, where we see that the previous governments, the previous regime have come back to power through a coalitions with the segment. Some of them are in the oppositions back then, but they form a coalitions to coup or to bring down the government that was elected by the people. So the prime minister have always have some legitimacy problems or legitimacy crisis on his back. That's why this COVID crisis actually give him a little bit of life, where he can put on all these restrictions, where he can I would say regroup himself, and also actually to deflect any motion of no confidence on his part. So he used also the COVID crisis to declare state of emergency, giving a lot of power to himself, because during the state emergency, a lot of power being concentrated around the Prime Minister and also the National Security Council. So they can bypass all of the function of the government bodies and also to make decisions. So they also bring back, because of the this emergency laws, some of the amendment was not tabled in the parliament. So through this they brought back some of the abolished law, like the Fake News Acts and whatnot. And after that they suspended the parliament session because since he had lost a majority, significant loss of majority. So it is impossible to test his majority in parliament because he had already suspended parliament. So there's no debate for public spending or how we manage the COVID crisis. No discussions on there's no way of knowing where the money is spent for COVID crisis and other stuff. So the emergency way is not to debate, was not debated in parliament. So there's a problem, legitimacy problem there. So after seeing this, the white flag and black flag movement came about lah. So there's a duality of movement here in Malaysia, where since the government are too busy in fighting over power, so a lot of things have been neglected, and there's a lot of flip-flops on the SOPs on how they manage the crisis as well. So the white flag movement are actually quite sporadic, or quite I would say quite naturally born, because a lot of people couldn't have food to eat A lot of them couldn't work. There's nationwide lockdown, and a lot of businesses have stopped operating, and a lot of businesses have shut down, and a lot of people have lost their source of income. So they couldn't have even food to sustain their life. So the white flag movement came about where if you don't have any food left in your home, or you need really dire needs of help, you would raise the white flags to signal an emergency that you would need some help. And during this time, activist social movement have galvanized their effort to help those people. They organize a lot of food bag, charity, and in terms of homelessness, we try our best to keep everyone's so that they have a place to stay and everything. So people would, this give a pretext for what comes next, because people see that through this movement that people, the government are not doing their job, and the people has to step up to help the people. So the tagline was that kita jaga itu, we keep ourselves, the people would I would say would keep, or like would lack of a better word, to sustain their our own people. So the Black Flag movement came rise actually as a duet, as a counterpart of the white flag movement, where it is a form of protest for the mismanagement of the COVID crisis by the government. So what we actually started off in Malaysia is, if you are not happy, you are really frustrated with how the government are managing the crisis as a whole, you would raise a black flag in your home. And these online protests have got a lot of tractions online, and people are snapping pictures. They are raising the black flags at their homes. And what happened next? We organized other stuff. Like we have a symbolic protest where we carried a corpse within the city center of Kuala Lumpur. And after that, because of this restriction that put forth by the government, where you cannot go out from a home without like a purpose, so we did a car convoy where we protested all throughout Malaysia within our cars, and we go around the cities carrying a black flag. And so I would say the outcome of that, we organized a bigger protest, which is after what we have done online. We think that the government is not listening to our demands. So we organized a Lawan protest. So this is quite a big rally. Given the context of we are in a pandemic, a lot of people are afraid to go out. We managed to get around 2,000 people to go out, protest in the city center of Kuala Lumpur. So we have three demands. First is to open the parliament. Second is to end the emergency. And the Prime Minister, as the head of government during that time, needs to step down, because it is upon him to manage the crisis well, but he fails to do so. So yeah. So the suppressions of basic human rights. So after that, we organized this protest. What happened is they put more pressure on us in terms of restrictions on the freedom of assembly and also online dissent. So what happened is they put through the MCO, it is actually a blanket restriction of people together in large numbers. Even though research have shown that even though it's being outside is much less risk than being inside, and through our protest, we actually have proven that there is no COVID infections that happen during the protest itself. And then after the Lawan protest, we organized another program, which is the vigil. So from this vigil, they have arrested us. So they already have seen that we can mobilize the people, and also they think that they need to suppress us a little bit. So during the vigil, they have actually arrested 31 of the vigil protesters. And leading up to another bigger protest on 21st, which we already cancelled because the government, the prime minister have stepped down. They've closed down 80 numbers of roads, and also they serve ex parte order from the from the court to actually to restrict like 50 numbers of individuals from being in Kuala Lumpur during the 21st protest, but we already cancelled this. But this shows that they are really scared of what the people can do and how we mobilize the people lah. And they also use in terms of the online dissent, because throughout the emergency and the movement control order, there's a lot of online dissents that have been happening as well. So they use the Multimedia and Communication Act to actually curb down or to clamp down on the online dissents. A lot of people being called to the police station, being charged under the Sedition Act and also the Communication Multimedia Act. They also arrested people over a tweet. Some of them are quite harmful. I think majority of them are very harmful. So they brought in these people for investigation. Some of them were arrested overnight just to clamp down on the freedom of expressions online. So what happened as well, they have suspended the rights of young voters. So before the emergencies happening, the bills to actually allow 18 years old and above until 21 years old to vote. So what happened is they suspended the rights of young voters without any concrete reasons. They said that we need more time to implement this law. So this also things that been happening in Malaysia. So another things that been happening in Malaysia is giving huge power to the state apparatus, like especially the police and immigration department. So as you can see, the police have been given the power to actually imposes the restriction movement order and actually to give compound on site to those who are flaunting the order, which is what been happening towards the protester lah. Some of them be compound up to 1,000 ringgit. So to pay this fine, we have launched a crowdfunding where we got numerous thousands of donations from the people to show that they are supporting of the Black Flag movement. And also there's widespread of immigration department arresting migrants. So a lot of thousands of migrants actually been arrested by the immigration departments to justify that or to blame them for the COVID crisis. They said that the migrant worker or the undocumented migrants are actually the cause of that happens why the surge in numbers of COVID cases lah. But this is all baloney, because we can see that it is actually caused by mismanagement of the people, and through the Black Flag movement and White Flag movement, we've shown that the people can mobilize themselves and actually bring down the Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin lah, because of this movement. And but what happened next is not a big change as well in Malaysia. It's only a reshuffle of people, the same people in the previous government have back in the new arrangements of this current government, and we don't reduce that. We will might need to go out and protest again for this government. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Interesting presentations in many different ways. First of all, Malaysia was a place where there was one of the most creative approaches to the COVID pandemic, and you actually led the effort which kind of transformed what used to be the human rights and pro-democracy movement into helping people who were raising white flags. And I think it's a very important lesson for movements across the globe that operate in a shrink environment. Speaking of Malaysia, we have this generational thing, which I think it's really thrilling. And as we see in Burma, the junta is messing with the wrong generation risen, in particular freedom. And whatever generals think, the conditions are very different than 1988. And people are very different. Most of them were born after that year. Same in Malaysia. Do you see the spark of hope in youth mobilization across the country? And can these events actually incentivize more young people to do protests and participation in the election? We remember on the last election, it was the corruption that outraged people and brought historic and unprecedented turnout of the generation. How do you predict the future, whatever happens now with your new government?
Yeah, through the Black Flag movement, we see that actually most of them, or like 80% of those who went to the protest, are people from 19 to 25 years old. So it's for me, even for me, it's quite shocking. So this movement have been brought up by the younger generations, the generation below me. So they're really good in new ways of protesting because they are more tech savvy than the previous government and working within the restrictions of the movement control order. They have come up with a lot of other creative ways to protest. So I see there's a lot of hopes from the young people. I think that's why also the government have actually reversed, because they don't want to go on with the Undi 18 or the young people voters, right? So they have make a U-turn after seeing that the young people can mobilize and actually have mobilized. So they're afraid that they don't want to upset the young people even more. So yeah.
Because they may be turning out to vote soon.
Correct.
And I think I also think that whatever the situation is and whatever the royalty says, the only way to resolve a Malaysian crisis may be through elections, because it's not about which kind of weird coalition you can create to create majority. It's about having a legitimate government in a time of crisis that each country demands. Speaking of phenomenon I mentioned, you were also the part of the group that was involved in a protest in solidarity to the people of Myanmar. How do you see this Milk Tea Alliance phenomenon and this phenomenon of horizontality across Asia, which I find very interesting thing to take a look at and also very hopeful?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of solidarity been happening around Asia as well towards other people's cause, especially what been happening in Myanmar. And young people especially because of their tech savvy, they've been getting a lot of information from there. They have friends over there. So they also actually been helping us in actually getting a lot of information and actually comparing what the situations over there and in Malaysia, and why it is important in Asian as a solidarity movement to come together to actually demand for a better government.
That's a good question. I also like to reflect that once we come back to the whole, and I have a Thai participant, because it seems that it works together. Now we had a stalemate in Thailand, and then the Burma happened, and the Thailand people started protesting solidarity in Burma. Now we have a large wave of protests in Thailand against the politics of their government as well. Speaking of audience, we get a question from audience for you, Matt. What is the role of press? Are they part of the problem or the solution? As at times, some journalist media companies display unethical behavior towards activists in your country.
Right. Like Brand have mentioned just now, because we try to make our movement leaderless and faceless, but the press, they actually like to have some individuals, some groups, few people that they can focus on and say that these are those who are actually leading the movement. But the reality, it is not like that. And we do keep explaining to the press that it is a movement by the people, for the people. And also it is quite natural, this movement born of quite natural way. But yeah, that's one of the challenge. But also previously the press have also been helping the police in giving them pictures of the protester, because some of them are actually publishing what the police have been saying about us, they will identify a lot of people in the protest and so on. So some of them are quite I would say helpful. They are really sympathetic to our cause and really for the cause. And some of them, because of the situation that I've just mentioned, they might pose a threat towards the activity itself by exposing our movement. But we have allies, yeah.
Yeah, the thing here is like one of the things that we mention very often is that symbols help, and obviously having a black flag is a symbol, and it helps to spread, it helps to identify things. Thinking about one unified platform where you can have goals and demands, and then rotating people who speak on behalf of the movement, but doesn't really matter who talks to press. It's the core principles and core demands which are really important. That if you have these on one place, you can have one face speaking to the press, or you can have 1 million faces speaking to the press. Doesn't really matter if the message is all the same. Okay, anybody from the real audience or the physical audience who wants to pose the question, or any kind of Thai comments? I'm also loving to hear something from Thailand, because it's such a thrilling place when it comes to the people power movements.
Hi, greetings from Asia Center. We have one of our colleagues here in Thailand who may respond to a remark here. So, yeah, Yawi, over to you. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Yawi. I'm a program coordinator at Asia Centers. I think I will just respond to such questions earlier, right? About that you asked Matt, right? About do you see any kind of hope? Right. So for me, if I can be frank, for 2020s, right, I have a particular cynical view that maybe Thai people do not believe in human rights, but 2020s is really like a watershed moment when due to the mismanagement of the pandemics, the youth and many people took to the street. And it's really shocking to me because they are like, as I think it's similar in Malaysia as well. They are like, 19 to 25, those who are aged, younger than me. Yeah, it's like, I didn't really expecting this. And the protest, build on momentum and still keep on going even at the moment. And the other aspect that is about the increasing transnational natures of the movement, right? You see the solidarity movement in Myanmar and the solidarity movement in between Thailand, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, the Multi Alliance. That I didn't really expect, and I kind of like feel that because of we do not fight this alone anymore. It's just it's keeping up the pressure on the authoritarian regimes inside and outside the region. So they could not just do whatever they want anymore, and that's like that's the pressure is quite constant. Yeah, and just to sum up, I kind of feel like maybe the future is not that that bad anymore. Yeah. Yep.
Great and very useful comment. Speaking about the future, just to summarize something I've tried to stress with both Matt and Ben. Don't forget Greta Thunberg. Don't forget the fact that probably 80% of people participating in the world's largest nonviolent movement, actually the climate change movement, is under 30. So when you take a look at these demographics, you know what happens when you see kids in McDonald's? That means more people will eat in McDonald's when their kids start earning money. When you see high school kids leaving schools for climate change or for being involved in a protest in Malaysia, protests and participation is something that holds with you for life. This is a kind of a viral infection, if we want to speak in a pandemic world. Once you feel it, you want more of it. And as Matt knows, it can get very addictive. And here is the old fart, 48 years old, and I still won't miss a good protest when I see one. So like speaking of this is very interesting dynamic. And I think speaking about it in Asia which is A, demographically super young part of the world, and B, when you take a look at the activism, it is held on mostly by very young people. It kind of underlines the tendency of more people participating, and also will probably, when Ben takes a look at his data in 2 or 3 years, these people will be coming up again, and there will be more younger people coming out again. So without further ado, I will try to summarize what we touched today. A pandemic world is dramatic. The challenges are great. B, wherever possible, the governments took their share of human rights and democracy freedoms, even in the countries which are considered to be democratic. C, however this fertile ground may be for shrinking human rights, there is a challenge in it, or there is an opportunity for people power movements. D, looking at the data, seems that people are not protesting less. They seem to be protesting more. Looking at the stability of these regimes, once again, take a look at the Belarus. This would never be happening 20 years ago. It is because of how Lukashenko handled COVID. Look at the way the Bolsonaro is challenged in Brazil. It's not about his right-wing politics or caring not for Amazon forests. It's about that he was making jokes with COVID until one large Brazilian province got 80% positivity in COVID. So taking a look at these things, we may be looking in the future with more people participating, whether they'll find a way to structure their demands, where they'll find a way to strategically impact the pillars of the status quo, where the governments will deal with this in a clever way, trying to involve them more or trying to crush them with a kinetic force. We are yet to see. However frozen the world have been looking in early 2020, we are looking into a very dynamic world in the years to come, regardless of the Delta variant. Without that note, I will once again say how grateful I am to Mr. Gomez and Chi for inviting Canvas here, how grateful I am for Ben staying night post-work hours doing his presentation. However grateful I am to Matt because of his great community work, his great pro-democracy work, and saying how I felt good speaking with all of you guys. I'm sending you a big hugs from Colorado Mountains, and stay well and have great rest of the conference. Please reward Chi, Gomez, Matt, and Ben with a round of applause.
May I, we still, Srdja, we still have some time.
Good.
So maybe I could just intervene here and ask 1 or 2 questions. Maybe I would like to provoke Matt for a second. I think I know what his answer will be, but Matt, in the course of your intervention, you mentioned the Black Flag movement as, you know, of course, expressing their dissatisfaction with the government, and you said that you used the term, you know, bring down the government. So I provoked a thought. A lot of the protest movements, there seems to be this idea, sorry, I shouldn't say a lot, but a number of protest movements, are they not subverting the democratic process? Because if your goal is, okay, I want to bring down this government, but that government got there using, even if we don't like it, using the regular parliamentary rules and procedures. Whether you like the previous PM or not, there were, you know, he used the parliamentary system to get there. And when we elect somebody, we accept that set of rules. So now if you don't like the policies, that's one thing. But maybe you could have a quick comment on that, and then maybe I could come to Ben for a follow-up thought.
Yeah, in case of Malaysia, I would, because I explained just now, this new prime minister actually is not came out of the elections. Of course, it was he was brought up through the right process of the parliamentary majority, you know. But he does not have a majority to begin with. That's why he actually suspended the parliament to not allow any show of majority in the parliament. So this is one of things that our demands in our protest, to open the parliament and debate things in the parliament. So we do respect the parliament's process and everything, but once we see that there is an autocratic tendencies by the prime minister to impede this process of parliamentary democracy, so we as a people, we can't stand this. So that's why we think that because of him doing that is actually a threat to democracy itself. That's why we, in the people, through the people movement, are calling for him to step down in the first place. And he get in this government also not from the elections. He was brought after that, after the Pakatan Harapan government have been brought down. Yeah.
Thanks for that, Matt. Before I ask my question to Ben, I just wanted to ask James to share some information for you.
Yeah, I thought I'll take the opportunity to highlight a joint report done together with the support of Canvas and also AFDA. This report looks at COVID-19 and democracy in Southeast Asia. We will send you the link now through the Zoom chat, so you could download the report. And I think some of the things that Srdja had outlined broadly in relation to Asia are captured here. Some of the fissures coming out of COVID-19 and its impact on civil society and democracy. So, just to share that this resource is available. And the second thing also, we want to reach out and say if anyone's out there, whether on the call or watching us via Facebook Live, or later on when you look at the video recording, if you are interested in some form of discussion or consultations around the work that Canvas does, please reach out to us, and we are very happy to put you in touch with them as well. So yeah, back to you, Robin. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for that, James. And please do, everyone listening, please have a look at the report. Let me come back to Matt understood. I got your point. I thought about it because I think it was you, Srdja, or somebody mentioned, oh no, maybe Ben mentioned the yellow vest protest. And one of the aspects, of that protest was a high degree of polarization and intolerance among the protesters, to the point where even in the current election cycle in France, somebody actually, went out and slapped the president, for example. So that's what triggered the thought. Ben, and maybe Srdja, you can also comment on this. In the troubles that the former Yugoslavia experienced, one of the former U.S. ambassadors, involved in the negotiations and so on, Richard Holbrooke, famously said, okay, fine, let's have a democratic system and so on in the various new republics. But then he famously said, what if someone we don't like comes to power? And so there, I'm thinking of that in relation to the whole wave of populism. Are the current protest movements, are they necessarily progressive, democratic, rights oriented? So maybe Ben, you could start.
Sure. Well, thanks for that great question. And let me also echo what you were saying about the report. I cited it in a Carnegie memo that I wrote. So I commend it very highly, and I urge all of the viewers to read it. If I can kind of add on to the comments that Matt was making in response to your question, I tend to view protests through the lens of representation. We see elections as an exercise in representation where people go to the ballot box and say, I want X person to represent the set of views, values, and policy preferences that I hold. But that's very episodic. We schedule elections in terms of years. But events don't necessarily move that way. A pandemic can emerge intermittently, some other crisis can break out, and people demand accountability, but they don't always want to wait until the next electoral cycle. But I think they're right to seek accountability from their leaders, whether in a democratic, a hybrid, or an authoritarian system. So when we view protest through the lens of representation, we view it as an exercise in political expression where people say, I don't like what this government is doing, regardless of whether or not they came to power via an electoral process. I view them as fundamentally doing the wrong thing. And I am going to show, along with thousands of my peers, why I think that. So when we view it in that term, in those terms, I think it squares that circle, because it's not subverting the democratic process, but rather complementing it. It is an exercise in accountability and representation, which is at its core what democracy is all about. In response to your question about populism and polarization, I think these are very interconnected. Kind of think of them as the three P's of the modern political era, right? Protests, populism, and polarization. The underlying dynamic that's foundational to all of these is a sense that the stakes of politics are rising. That no longer is it about tax rates or whether or not some small project is going to get done, but rather it's about the future of the planet. It's about your survival in the face of a massive public health threat. It's about your economic well-being amid a huge wave of globalization and economic displacement. The stakes are high, and people feel engaged in a way they never have before. This is why we're seeing the rise of protests, but it comes amid a rise of what I and my colleague Tom Carruthers have called confrontational politics, where as those stakes go up, so too do we see a rise in confrontational political strategies like populism, protests to an extent, and polarization. So they're all very interrelated, and I think you can't extricate them fully from one another. The polarization can often be toxic for democracy, as can the populism, but protests, I think, ultimately at their core, to come back to the previous question, are a fundamentally democratic exercise.
Speaking of that, I will just add something that characterizes the protests. It's not about whether you agree or disagree with the ideology of the group that sparks the protests, and this is where I will go back to the yellow vests. It's where the group understand that the numbers for real social change are more toward mainstream than towards extreme. So the more you limit your demands to what is very extreme, the less you're likely to succeed. That works from left to right, doesn't really matter where you stand for, atheism, religion. So the more extreme you become in your politics, the less you're likely to reach the middle. This is the evolution of yellow vests. It started as a protest against Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, cutting the traditionally very, very widely appreciated social politics, retirement politics, and tax politics in France, because he wanted to stabilize the economy. And especially because he doesn't have the real base, he's kind of a newcomer. He tends to be all over the place, but he's not even center left or center right. This is something that the previous French presidents didn't really want to tackle. It sparked a very wide protest of the people from all walks of life, rural people, urban people. The more it kind of narrowed into the anti-Macron, the more it was infected with the populist sentiment, which was at the time growing in Europe, the more it was leaning right, if you want. It could be left as well. The lesser the number of the people, the more violent it became. And then the violence contributed to losing numbers. So when you take a look at these kind of dynamics, it's not only what protest starts, it's a life cycle of a protest. If, however, you oppose this look and take a look at the LGBT movement, for example, it started as a very extreme cry for help from a very narrow group in US, which was in the position where the LGBT people now, unfortunately, are in Indonesia. But it got to the point where this movement was actually shifting the tune, talking more mainstream, getting through the institutions, getting through the elections, even overtaking the key argument of its opposition, which is family values. So if you take a look at the evolution of this movement, you will see how it strategically took over the middle of the terrain. If any of you have ever watched the soccer games, you know the team that controls the middle field is the team that has better chances to win or has better ball possession and more shoots on goal. So looking into this soccer relationship, whatever comes, wherever the movement is coming, whether this is left or right, it needs to understand that the real numbers are in the middle. And now you have a people who are discussing climate change in the farmhouses in Iowa because they're losing crops and cattle. And these people are considered to be traditional Republican, traditionally socially very conservative. But when you take a look at the climate change, they're losing money, they're losing jobs. The big vendors are coming and eating their farms because they don't have irrigation anymore. So climate change is now their issue. And when you take a look at where these wars are coming from, they're coming from everything but the liberal environment. And it's more or less, you see this trend across the globe. Why? Because the environmental movement that started in '60 as a bunch of crazy hippies tying themselves for the fences of the nuclear power plant developed the middle ground, the middle game. Now you have Environmental Protection Agency. It embraced the bulk of scientists. It embraced the mainstream politicians. When you take a look at this family of people fighting for the safe of our planet, it's far wider, where the opposition to it shrinks, where it is coming from right, where it's coming from autocracy, where it's coming from the governments that don't want to be challenged or want to exploit national resources. Whatever it is, you see the movements that are gaining ground that are going less extreme, not more extreme. And it worked in all walks of life. So this was a kind of a generalization of your question about the Yellow Vests.
Srdja, I see the future generation is there with you. So maybe
this is Leah, the future princess of the resistance.
Very good, wonderful, lovely to meet her. Maybe one last question, and maybe this is more directed to you, Srdja. Yeah, so in the remaining let's say 4 minutes or so, I think I know your answer, and I understand completely where you are coming from. If you look at the democracy and human rights movement historically, one sees that the movement has progressed in parallel with the, how shall we say, the rise of particular powers. So would you say that the geopolitics of rights and democracy no longer are important or that important, and that the popular protest movements, activism by ordinary people is now where the power has shifted to as we try to take forward human rights? We have seen, Ben, maybe you could speak to this, even in the United States, in the last 4 or 5 years, we have seen how fragile the United States democracy is, and how it takes leadership to carry that forward and to protect and preserve it, not only in the United States, but everyone is looking to leadership of the United States in this arena, here in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So maybe I'll start with Srdja. What's your thought on that about the geopolitics?
Geopolitics matters, and it will always matter, because the more geopolitical connections Russia has with Georgia or Ukraine, the more it is likely to invest into its soft power, propaganda power, internet power, or in some cases, military power. However, you can install or elect the president like Yanukovych the day he decides Ukraine doesn't want to go to the European Union, you have millions of people off the street who wants to go to European Union, regardless of the person who is democratically elected, but immediately start behaving as a Russian puppet wants to do. So yes, geopolitics works, and but the people power, like they set the stage in a way and they influence the conditions, but very often the numbers and the skills of the people involved in this processes matter more than the set of conditions. And then when you take a look, there is another interesting dilemma that we don't have time to discuss. When you take a look at this violence, non-violence thing, look at the Myanmar, the more the opposition embraces this pathetic attempt to create the army and challenge Tatmandav in the field of military, the more it is likely to be ending as a Syrian opposition. So that works internally. That also works externally. Wherever you find a place where Western countries, the United States, are supportive of NGOs, are supportive of democratic defenders, but through the nonviolent social change, you can see these type of movements blossoming. And then you take a look at the Afghanistan, where two largest world superpowers try to impose their political system, first Soviet Union, then the United States, and you take a look at how it ends. So like you don't create stability with bombs, regardless of where you are geopolitically or how large your military is. It is more like nurturing the protests of, popular domestic movements. And I think this is something that kind of blurs the wide picture, because you have all of this protests and say, the geopolitics really works. Geopolitics are setting the stage. Geopolitics will always be very important, but we are looking in a very global world. The digital cuisine in Russia can produce a wreaking havoc in how Americans perceive vaccine, for example. I would give you just one example. But then it can come back and bite Russia for ass, because now this is the least vaccinated country. So you spill this virtue somewhere else, but the people are reading this. And you think that keeping them stupid and away from truth will actually help you geopolitically, but then at the end of the day, it can hurt you domestically. So it's a really interesting world, and this has nothing to do with geopolitics. It has something to do with the world of social media and world assault on truth. But next time, invite Peter Pomerantsev to speak about this. He's the world leading expert on this.
Thank you, Srdja. Maybe a quick reaction in 30 seconds or so from Ben, and as we wrap up the session.
Sure. Just on the United States point, I would say that after the prior administration, look, the United States' hard power is not reduced, right? The military budget is still the same. Economic power is still the same. It's still the world's most powerful economy. But what's different on the democracy plane in this administration is that it's embracing humility. It's embracing democracy and human rights from a place of recognizing that we've had our own struggles, and what other democracy in the world hasn't struggled, and embracing that realization as an organizing principle and as a starting point for leveling with other democratic and non-democratic partners. I actually think will, in the long run, strengthen the United States' appeals to democracy and human rights, and make our geopolitical clout in that field stronger in the long run.
Thank you very much. Let me turn the floor over maybe to James.
Yeah, thank you very much, colleagues on panel 6. Thank you, Canvas, for co-convening this panel. Thank you, Srdja, Matt, and Ben, for speaking at this session.